Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. Papa Boris here, playing some more chess. Now, I do want to show some more games by Nezhmetdinov, but in the previous video, I showed Nezhmetdinov's Immortal against Lev Polugaevsky, so I thought it was only fair to show a game by Lev Polugaevsky before we go back to Nezhmetdinov, because Polugaevsky was definitely one of the strongest players of the mid-20th century, and in particular, he was extremely good against aggressive players. He wasn't necessarily like a defensive player, but his positional style was very, very good against players who like to go on the attack. He had a really ridiculous record against Mikhail Tal, 8 wins to 2 losses. He also had positive records against Nezhmetdinov and Geller, who were 2 very aggressive players in their day. And then in this game, he had the white pieces versus Mikhail Tal, and this was played in 1969, so a little bit of a later game, but still definitely a time when Mikhail Tal was a very strong player. Polugaevsky opened with c4, the English opening, and after knight to f6 and knight to c3, we have this move e6. So this has a variety of names. According to the engine, it can be called the Anglo-Indian defense or the hedgehog system. Polugaevsky chose knight f3, and then Tal stroke out in the center with d5. Now, Polugaevsky stayed calm. He didn't exchange here. Remember, you don't want to exchange tension unless you have a reason to, so he kept the tension going with d4, and this actually transposes now into the queen's gambit declined, where white plays d4, black plays d5, and then white plays c4. Still a very common opening, and pretty good game options for both sides. Here we have c5, so we have a lot of tension here in the center, and this looks a lot like the Tarrasch defense. You know, these openings are very incestuous and can transmute into each other at a moment's notice. We have this key block of 4 pawns, and then these knights signaling the Tarrasch. At this point, Polugaevsky decided to get rid of some of the tension in the center with c takes d5, Tal took with the knight, and then Polugaevsky played e4 to establish a center. This invites black to exchange off these 2 knights, which Tal does, and now white's got this nice and fairly safe center. It's a little bit difficult for black to crack. On the other hand, black's position is also fine, and he can get to work getting his pieces developed. Tal elects to develop his bishop with tempo, giving check on b4, and after these bishops are exchanged, Tal castles. So this looks like it's going to be a pretty quiet and unremarkable game. Half the minor pieces have been exchanged. There's no crazy pawn advances. It looks like it's going to be normal and quiet. We have a couple more developing moves here. Polugaevsky himself castles. Obviously, he's not going to castle queenside here with this whole area totally exposed. And then Tal goes about his business with b6, getting ready to develop this bishop on this diagonal, which makes sense because this pawn is currently blocking this bishop's development, but Tal doesn't necessarily want to push it and expose this bishop along this sensitive diagonal, which we've seen be important in a number of games. So, some more developing moves. Polugaevsky develops his rook behind the queen on the d-file. The bishop gets developed by black. Get the other rook developing on the e-file. And then just a normal-looking game. Tal plays knight to a5, attacking this bishop on c4, forcing it to put up or shut up. And Polugaevsky decides to shut up. He goes back to d3. And with the bishop on d3, there is this idea that maybe white could push this pawn and attack this bishop on h7. This is a very classic sacrifice in chess. After the bishop sacrifices himself on h7, the knight jumps to g5, and then usually what you'd expect is for the queen to be able to jump to h5. Here, with the white queen on d2, it's not exactly possible. But definitely, it's not one of those things where, like, if the sacrifice were to happen, Tal would have been blown away by it. At the grandmaster level, when there's a bishop on d3 and then there's no knight on f6, the sacrifice on h7 is something that both players are keeping in consideration at all times. Well, for the time being, Tal played rook to c8, developing his rook on the open c-file, and just to note, we're 15 moves into the game, it's a good chunk of time, and the position is more or less equal. So neither player has played the opening badly. Both players are doing a great job here. It's just what you'd expect from a game between 2 world-class players. Now Polugaevsky makes his move. A safe maneuver might have been to play something like queen to f4 and try to get this queen out into position so the knight could come and coordinate an attack on h7. But Polugaevsky almost starts to play like Tal here. He plays d5, a rather daring move that opens up the position. And after Tal takes the pawn, Polugaevsky doesn't recapture. Instead, he pushes e5. This is, according to the engine, initially not a good move, but as you let the engine think about it more, the engine actually likes this move more and more. That being said, the engine still would have been happier if white had just exchanged on d5. So that's why I'm saying that Polugaevsky here, being a positional player, here in this game chose to play a little bit like Tal. He made a somewhat unorthodox pawn sacrifice, and there's not technically any material advantage for Polugaevsky in this position. Now Tal plays knight to c4, which is interesting because this is the engine recommended move, but once it's made, the engine doesn't necessarily like black's position that much more than it did on the previous move. And part of the reason may be that after white plays queen to f4, this queen is kind of getting ready, to get out here and start making trouble on h7. Now Tal played another engine recommended move, knight to b2. And he did this perhaps thinking that Polugaevsky wouldn't dare to play bishop takes h7 here. The idea, of course, here is that the knight is forking the rook and the bishop, and after the rook moves, the knight can exchange away, get rid of this bishop, and now black's position is speechy keen. He's not like winning or anything like that, but this would definitely be an advantage for black. And Polugaevsky sensed this, and he decided to go for bishop takes h7 anyway. At the moment, like when you click this move, the engine does not like it. The engine thinks that black is better, but what's interesting is that after you play out some moves, the engine actually starts to think that white is better. So this was a very deep sacrifice. It's one that is beyond the horizon, at least of the engine that I am using. Now the idea here is that normally after the king takes on h7 and the knight comes to g5 check and then the king goes back, white would have queen to h5, which white does not here. But what white does have is queen to h4, threatening checkmate on h7, and there's no wriggling out by pushing the f-pawn because the knight is covering the f7 square. So the only way that black would have of avoiding mate here would be to move this rook and have the king run this way. But now white has this resource, e6. And the idea here is that black is totally lost now. If black makes some regular move, like taking the rook, then white has this combination e7, and regardless of which piece recaptures, when the e7 square is blocked and the black king can't escape that way, the white queen gives checkmate on h8. So to stop this, black has to take the pawn. But how do you actually take it? If you take with the pawn, then white's going to sneak in there. These are all forced moves. And after king to d6, congratulations, you just lost your queen. The knight forked your king and your queen. Whoops. So you can't take with the pawn. All right, let me try to give up the exchange and take it with the rook. But the problem here is that now after rook takes e6, white's actually threatening to give checkmate since the rook is covering e7. So there's nothing really for black to do except take the rook back. But then the knight takes on e6. And again, the king and queen have been forked. When the smoke is cleared, white has a queen for two minor pieces. So all white has to do is move the rook so it's not attacked by the knight, and white has a completely winning game here because the material is just not up to snuff and black has no counterplay. So that is what happens if after the bishop is taken and knight g5 is played, the king goes to g8. But I think, if I had to guess, Tal figured that Polugaevsky wouldn't go in for this sacrifice because Tal doesn't have to go back to g8. He pushes bravely forward with king to g6. And this is, again, very interesting. I'm going to take us back a little bit. Right here, the engine is saying that black's better. And right here, the engine is saying that black is definitely better. The engine also acknowledges that you have to take the bishop. If you go to h8, then this is just terrible. After knight to g5, the king is completely pinned here, and white's getting in there with e6 and, either mating the king or winning a whole butt ton of material. So the engine knows that you have to take the bishop, and then after knight to g5 check, the engine thinks that white is better regardless of where the black king moves. So you follow like a forced line, and when you get there, the engine's like, whoops, actually, nope, I was wrong. Seems like white is actually better here, even though I told you that black was definitely better a moment ago. So after king g6, what exactly does white do? Well, Polugaevsky finds the engine move here, and of course engines are very good at tactics. He finds h4. So the idea here is that you're going to play h5 and draw this king out and get it into some hot water. Now, the best defense for black here may have been a move like either f5 or queen to e7. And I want to show you why, but it'll be easier to see if we let a few moves pass. Tal chose rook to c4, which is not the best defense. It's a very human move because it's defending by attacking, but watch what happens. After h5 check, black has no choice but to play king to h6. This is the only option. If black were to play the other possible move here, which is king takes h5, then there's actually a mate in 4 after g4 check. So now there's no running back to g6 because this pawn is here and it's protecting the f5 square, so white can play queen to f5 check. And after king to h6, there's this cute little tactic. After the knight gets out of the way, the queen goes to h5 and it's checkmate. There are some other variations here, but the point is that after g4, black is getting forcibly mated no matter where the king tries to run. So the king has to go to h6 since that's the only other option. Now white plays knight takes f7 check, and this is why you wanted to push f5 or play queen to e7. If the queen were on e7, or if the pawn were on f5, then after king takes h7, or king to h7, queen f5 check, king g8, and e6, if the queen were on e7, black would actually be able to munch this knight, so e6 wouldn't actually work as a continuation of the attack. And of course, if the pawn had been pushed to f5, then the knight wouldn't have been able to jump in here in the first place. But now, because black chose to play rook to c4, this rook looks really stupid. This forcing sequence of the h5 and the knight to f7 and the queen to f5 check was going to happen regardless. So this rook looked like it was attacking the queen, but the queen wanted to leave anyway. And so now the rook essentially did nothing. It's like Tal was in a defensive position. He needed to protect himself, and he spent a move doing nothing, which was a little bit of a disaster. Now here Tal finds the best defense for black, and it's difficult to do because this is a very difficult situation for the black side to hang on for life. He finds queen to f6. So the idea is it's blocking the white queen's access to this f-file and also threatening an exchange of queens, which of course would be bad for white because when you're down material and trying to do an attack, you don't want to exchange queens. Except Polugaevsky's genius here was the realization that white can exchange queens and still be winning. At this point, white is down a whole piece for only a single pawn. But after rook to d2, black's in a heap of trouble because this knight's under attack and black can't afford to lose this knight. Not with these, passed pawns here in the endgame. Black's gotta keep the extra material. But if black tries to protect the knight, for example, by playing knight to a4, then white plays knight to d6. And the problem here is that this rook is attacked, and this pawn is ready to roll all the way to the end. In particular, the e7 push would be with tempo against this rook. So Tal realized that he was actually toasted. He had to play rook to c6 to stop this terrible knight d6 retreat and prevent white from just getting to push his passed pawn freely. Now Polugaevsky recaptured the knight on b2. The smoke is cleared, the material is equal, except that black is down a pawn and white has much more advanced passed pawns than black does, which in the endgame is a huge deal. Now, there was still a fight to this game. The engine is saying that white's about a pawn ahead. So, potentially, if black had played his very, very best and Polugaevsky had slipped, then this game could have potentially been fought to a draw. Tal played rook to e8, which is fine. And after knight to h6 check, Tal played king to h7, attacking the knight. The knight retreated to f5, and then Tal won back the pawn on e6, which is certainly good for him. So what do you do here as white? Well, Polugaevsky exchanges rooks. Then he plays rook to c2. A very clever move. The idea here is simply to control the c-file and also threaten check on c7, which would fork the king and the bishop. And you have to respond to this very precisely, which Tal, being a former world champion and world caliber player, does. Tal was also a very underrated endgame player. There's a few lists on chessgames.com that show that he was pretty great at the endgame. It's just that people didn't pay attention to it as much because he was such an explosive, dynamic player on the attack. But Tal finds rook to c6. He realizes that he has to exchange rooks here if that means blocking the white rook from getting to c7. The only issue is that now Polugaevsky plays rook to e2. Notice these very precise rook maneuvers. Again, the threat is the same, rook to e7 check, forking king and bishop, but now the e6 square isn't protected for black, so black can't put this rook to e6 to block. And here's where Tal slipped. The correct defense would have been to play rook to c7, stopping the rook from getting in here, or at least if the rook does get in here, then it gets traded off. Now, maybe what Tal didn't like about this is that white has rook to e8, and the rook is kind of infiltrating black's position a little bit. But after bishop to c8 here, this is a pretty equal position, and black is totally fine. He can fight his way to a draw. And so maybe if Tal had noticed this, he would have been okay. Alternatively, white could play rook to e6, which is the better continuation for white. And then black basically needs to sacrifice his d-pawn to get this knight out of here and let the king advance. And, then white's still better, but it would have been a fight. Unfortunately, Tal got his move order mixed up a little bit. Instead of playing rook to c7 and then bishop to c8, he played bishop to c8 first. And the problem with this is that it allows the rook to come to e7 with check. And here, black has to play very precisely or it's all over. Tal played king to h8, which is a losing move. And it may seem remarkable that this is a losing move, whereas king to g8 lets the fight keep on going. So let's see why that difference of these two squares makes such a big difference. Thing is, after king to h8, Polugaevsky being the world caliber player that he is, he found the right way to continue this, which is knight to h4. And now you can see that we've got a major problem. The knight is going to come to g6 with check, and then this pawn is actually ready to roll. It's going to go to h6, then h7 is protected by white's rook, and then if the knight's on g6, then h8 is protected by the knight. And on top of that, after knight goes to g6 and the king goes to g8, when the pawn reaches h7, it's going to be with tempo against the black king. So it's one of those things that, like, here the position seems more or less fine, but then all of a sudden white plays knight to h4, and black's like, oh crap, I'm screwed. Now, the correct defense here would have been to play king g8, although white is still winning this game at this point. But Tal decided to go downhill much more rapidly. He played f5. And I'm honestly not exactly sure what the point of f5 is. Maybe it's to unleash the rook on this rank so that white can't push the pawn. But the problem is that after knight to g6 check and king g8, white just plays rook takes a7. So here, white can't push the pawn, of course, because then black takes the knight, and then it's going to be a win for black, or perhaps even a drawn game. But I guess Tal missed this move simply taking the pawn on a7, because the rook vacating e7 leaves a major problem for black. The knight is threatening to come here and fork the king and the rook. But the king can't move. It doesn't have any legal squares. And this bishop is a light bishop, so it can't protect e7. So the rook has to move. But where does the rook go? If you move the rook up, then the rook loses its sight of g6, and then white can push this pawn, and there's no stopping it. In fact, this is a forced mate in a few moves. If you move the rook sideways, then the rook loses protection of the bishop, and then white can just pick up the bishop by forking it like this, because, the knight on e7, in addition to forking the rook on c6 and the king on g8, also forks the bishop on c8. And then, of course, when white is up a piece, the game is totally over. So the rook needs to keep an eye on the bishop, and it needs to keep an eye on the knight, but it can't be on c6. That is an impossible puzzle, and at this point in the game, black resigned. I do want to show you, just for those of you who are curious, back here where I said king to h8 was a mistake, if black had played king to g8 here, then white's maneuver doesn't actually work, because after knight to h4, black can actually play this f5 move. And then if white tries to jump in there with knight to g6, notice that the king's on g8, not h8, so that there's no check with this move. Here, black could have actually pushed d4. And now, after h6, black takes the knight. And if white tries the same trick with rook takes a7, black has d3. And if white comes in here and grabs... Whoops, that's not right. If white comes in here and grabs the rook, then after d2, even though white has a rook, a knight, and a king, white actually can't stop this pawn from queening. And so at this point, white would lose the game. If Tal had tried this exact same sequence, because he had put his king on g8 and knight to g6 had been with check, his pawn would have been on d3 instead of on d2. And with the pawn on d3, it would have been possible for white to stop it. White could have, just played like king to f1, for example, and then gobbled up the pawn before it got there. And it just goes to show the importance of a single move, a single tempo sometimes in chess. Well, thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe. Once again, this was the final position. And at this point, again, I'll just show you if black tries to push the pawn. The pawn's only on d3. And there's actually other ways white could stop the pawn. White could even play rook to a8 here. And if you push the pawn one more time, white grabs the bishop with check. And after the king moves, rook to d8 stops the pawn one turn before it would have queened. Hope you enjoyed this game. Please like and or subscribe if you did. And I'll see you again soon for some more chess. Take care, everybody.